In the red clay hills of central Mississippi, there's a mound of earth over 200 feet long and 30 feet high, older than the nation that now claims the ground beneath it. The Choctaw call it Naniwaya, the mother mound, the place where their people came up out of the earth into the light. But that is not the only story this ground holds. Long before the mound was a shrine, Choctaw elders said it was a battlefield. And the enemy was not another town, not another clan. It was a people already living on this land when the ancestors of the Choctaw arrived, a people the old accounts called the Nahulo, described generation after generation the same way every time. Too tall, too strong, not like us. The oral record was written down in the 1890s by a man named Horatio Bardwell Cushman, raised among the Choctaw, fluent in their language, trusted enough that elders spoke to him plainly. He recorded a war. He recorded a people driven from this valley or destroyed in it, and he recorded that the mound the Choctaw call sacred sits on the ground where that war supposedly ended. 19th century newspapers, digging where they should not have, claimed to find the proof. Skeletons pulled from mounds across the Mississippi Valley reported in inches no ordinary grave should hold. Most of those reports cannot be checked today. The bones were never kept. The measurements were never verified by anyone qualified to verify them. That is true, and it matters, and we are not going to pretend otherwise. What is also true, the mound is real. The excavation is real. The tradition is real. Recorded from Choctaw mouths, not invented for this video. And nobody, not the archaeologists who dug here in the 1960s, not the Choctaw traditionalists who still hold ceremony on this ground every August, has ever fully agreed on what Nahulo actually means. A myth kept alive because it explains something, or a memory of something that actually happened here before anyone was writing anything down. Stay to the end, we're going to show you both. Naniwaya sits near present-day Noxapater in Winston County, Mississippi, on a low rise above a creek that still carries the same name. It is not the biggest earthwork in North America. Cahokia, 600 miles northwest, dwarfs it. But size was never the point of this one. Naniwaya was never meant to hold a city. It was built and rebuilt and returned to for one purpose, to mark where the Choctaw people believe they began. The origin story survives in more than one version because it was carried by more than one town, but the core of it does not change. In the beginning, the ancestors of the Choctaw came up out of the ground itself, through the mound, wet and blind like newborns, and lay in the sun on its slopes until they were dry enough to stand. Some versions add a companion story, a great migration from the west, a sacred pole planted in the ground each night, followed until the morning it finally stood upright and did not lean, and that was the sign. Stop walking, this is home. Either way, every telling ends in the same place here. This mound, archaeologists who have surveyed the site date construction to somewhere around the year 1200, built up in stages by the Mississippian-era ancestors of the Choctaw and neighboring peoples. The same wide mound-building tradition responsible for Cahokia, for Moundville in Alabama, for Etowah in Georgia. That fact alone tells you something the old myths already knew. This was not an isolated people building in a vacuum. Something connected the mound towns of the entire southeast trade routes and shared symbols stretching for 1,000 miles, centuries before any European ship reached this coast. The mound survived the collapse of that Mississippian world. It survived the Choctaws' own removal in the 1830s, when most of the nation was marched west along the Trail of Tears, and only a fraction of the people remained behind in Mississippi. It survived amateur digging in the 1800s when landowners and curiosity seekers cut into it looking for treasure and found nothing they understood. And it survived, barely, a 2021 act of vandalism that damaged the earthwork itself. An event Mississippi Choctaw leaders called an assault on a living sacred site, not a ruin. Because that is the part easy to miss from a distance. Naniwaya was never abandoned. Every August, the Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians still gathers at the mound for Naniwaya Day. Prayers, flag postings, ceremony held on the same rise where the origin story says their ancestors first stood in the sun. Whatever else Naniwaya used to mean, it is not a relic, it is a return address. The mound-building world Naniwaya belonged to did not end at the Choctaw's borders. 600 miles northwest at Cahokia, a single earthwork called Monk's Mound covers more ground than the base of the Great Pyramid at Giza. 200 miles south at Moundville in Alabama, archaeologists have opened more than 3,000 burials beneath a platform complex that once rivaled Cahokia for size. Farther east at Etowah in Georgia, excavators pulled copper plates out of the mounds engraved with human figures in a style no one in that region had ever produced before or since. Different sites, different nations, the same unanswered question trailing behind almost every one of them. Who were the people strong enough, organized enough, to move that much earth by hand? And why does local memory at so many of these places insist that whoever came before them was somehow larger than life? The origin story of Naniwaya is the one every visitor learns first. The one fewer people hear is what the old tellers said came before it. According to the tradition Cushman recorded, and he was careful to say he was recording it, not inventing it, the land around the mound was not empty when the ancestors of the Choctaw arrived. It was occupied by a people already known to Choctaw storytellers by a specific name, Naholo. In the Choctaw language, the word carries an unsettling weight even now. It is the same root later applied after contact to describe outsiders and strangers of unknown, unplaceable origin. Something other, something not fully known. The descriptions passed down agree on very little except one detail, repeated across tellings collected a century apart: size. Not large in the ordinary way one warrior might be larger than another, but large enough that the difference itself became the story. Bodies pulled from later burials that elders pointed to and said, "These are not us. These belong to the ones who were here first." What the Naholo were said to have done next is where the traditions split hardest. Some tellings describe open war, a long, costly conflict fought across the mound-building river valleys of the southeast, ending only when the ancestors of the Choctaw, through numbers or alliance or simple persistence, drove the last of them out. Other versions are stranger and darker, not a war of armies at all, but something closer to a purge. The Naholo remembered less as invaders than as a danger living among the people themselves, dealt with quietly, the details smoothed over by every generation that retold it. We are not going to pretend to know which version is closer to whatever actually happened, because nobody alive can know that. What we can tell you is that this is not folklore invented for a documentary script. It is recorded oral history, gathered directly from Choctaw elders in the 1890s by someone the community itself trusted to write it down, decades before anyone had a reason to dress it up for an audience like this one. And whatever the Naholo actually were, the story does not end with their disappearance. It ends with the mound, because in the version told most often, the final battleground, the last stand, the place it was finally settled, was Naniwaya itself, the same ground the Choctaw would later name as their own point of origin. A shrine built on top of whatever happened there first. For most of the last 2 centuries, the only physical claims about outsized remains in this region came from exactly the kind of source you should be suspicious of: 19th century newspapers competing with each other for readers, reporting mound excavations by farmers and treasure hunters with no training and, often enough, no bones left to check afterward. Reports out of the Mississippi and Ohio valleys through the 1800s describe skeletons measured at 7, 8, even 9 feet, numbers that, if true, would rewrite basic human biology. None of those specific remains survive today in any collection a modern scientist can examine. That absence is not neutral. It is itself evidence, and honest archaeology treats it as such. What modern professional excavation actually found at sites like Naniwaya is more restrained and in its own way more interesting. Controlled digs in the mid-20th century confirmed the platform mound construction technique, layered basket loads of earth built up over generations, consistent with mound centers across the wider Mississippian world. They found evidence of ceremonial use, not habitation. This was never a village, it was a place people came to. What they did not find was a mass grave of giants, waiting to settle the question either way. So where does that leave the tradition? Not proven, not disproven either. Somewhere in the gap between a story too specific and too consistent to have been invented from nothing, and a physical record too thin and too compromised by 2 centuries of amateur digging to confirm it. There is a third possibility, and serious historians take it seriously, that Nahulo was never a claim about literal height at all, that a difference in build, in weapons, in unfamiliar technology or custom could calcify over enough retellings into a story about giants, the way folk memory across cultures tends to turn very different from us into very much bigger than us. If that is what happened here, the story is not a lie. It is something more human than that, a folk memory of first contact with the people who were, in whatever way actually mattered at the time, simply not like the ones telling the story afterward. Here's the part that should make you uneasy in a useful way. Naniwaya is not the only place in North America where this exact shape of story survives. Travel 1,100 miles north, into the Ohio and Susquehanna valleys, and the Lenape tell of the Talijawai, a walled, mound-building people encountered when the Lenape's ancestors first arrived from the west, fought for a generation, and eventually displaced. Travel into Iroquois country in upstate New York, and you find the Stonish giants, Janongswa, remembered in Seneca and Haudenosaunee tradition as an older stone-skinned man-eating people finally destroyed by a culture hero. Different nations, 1,000 miles and probably 1,000 years apart, who never read each other's oral histories and had no reason to copy one another. And yet the pattern repeats. We arrived, someone larger and stranger was already here, and there was a reckoning before the land became ours. That repetition is exactly why serious historians will not simply wave the whole tradition away as coincidence or borrowed folklore. A single giant story is a curiosity. A dozen of them, independently recorded across unrelated language families and unrelated geography, all clustering around the same kind of place. A mound, an earthwork, a built thing too large for the memory of who built it, starts to look less like fantasy and more like a genuine continent-wide folk memory of something. The disagreement has never been about whether that pattern is real. It has always been about what the pattern is actually memory of. Whatever was buried at Naniwaya, the mound itself has spent most of its recorded history under threat from people who never asked permission to dig. Landowners in the 1800s cut trenches into the earthwork looking for the treasure that treasure hunting always assumes a mound must hold. They found none because that was never what the mound was for. In 2021, someone drove heavy equipment onto the site and gouged into the surface, an act of damage serious enough that Mississippi Choctaw officials publicly called it out as vandalism against an active, living sacred place, not an abandoned archaeological curiosity. The mound had to be repaired. The community had to hold ceremony on ground that had just been violated again. That detail matters more than it might seem. Every time this story gets told as pure mystery, lost giants, vanished race, ancient secret, it is easy to forget that the mound in question is not lost. It is not secret. It has a name, a location anyone can drive to, and a living nation that never stopped returning to it. The mystery belongs to the deep past. The mound itself belongs right now to people who are still here. That is also, quietly, the answer to a question this video has not asked directly yet. Who won? Whatever happened between the ancestors of the Choctaw and whoever the Naholo actually were, the ground still carries only one people's name for it. Not a lost civilization's monument, a living one's front door. Ask a Choctaw traditionalist today about Nani Waya, and the giants are rarely the first thing they bring up. What comes first is the cave, a smaller opening near the base of the mound, said in some tellings to be the literal birth canal of the origin story, the exact spot the first people climbed out of the dark and into the sun. What comes first is the migration story, the leaning pole, the long walk that ended here. What comes first is family, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, and by some tellings the Muskogee Creek as well, all tracing back to the same mound, the same morning. The Naholo survive in the tradition too, but as background, the reason the mound had to be earned before it could be claimed, maybe, or simply the oldest layer of a story that has had 800 years to accumulate new ones on top of it. Cushman wrote it down because he was told it, not because he went looking for a giant story to sell that is worth remembering every time this kind of history gets picked up by people who were not. Nobody living today watched what happened at Nani Waya. If anything happened there at all beyond the ordinary human business of one group of people meeting another and one of them not surviving the meeting. What survived instead is a name passed down with real weight behind it, a mound still standing after 8 centuries of weather and looting, and one act of outright vandalism, and a nation that has never needed the giants to be real in order to keep coming back. So, a lost race of outsized people driven from the Mississippi Valley in a war fought before any written record, or a folk memory of an ordinary brutal displacement, retold by enough generations that different quietly became giant. The old newspapers cannot settle it. The controlled excavations cannot settle it. Even the Choctaw elders who kept the story alive the longest never claimed to have seen a Nahulo themselves, only to have been told the same way we are telling you now. What we do know is that the mound is still there, that the ceremony is still held every August, that the story never needed us to believe it in order to survive this long without us. Was it real? Or was it never meant to be taken that literally in the first place? That's still an open question. It was an open question when Cushman wrote it down in 1899, and it's an open question now.